She was the first influencer before the word existed, created, consumed, and discarded by the machinery of fame itself. The paramedics found her face down on the bed, silver earrings still catching the dim morning light filtering through the Santa Barbara hotel curtains. November 16th, 1971. Edie Sedgwick, 28 years old, the girl who had once been called the most beautiful creature that ever lived, lay motionless in a crumpled nightgown, her platinum hair spread across the pillow like spilled mercury. The needle marks on her arms told a story the official report would carefully omit. The empty barbiturate bottles on the nightstand whispered secrets the world wasn't ready to hear. Her husband, Michael Post, had been sleeping beside her just hours before, unaware that the woman who had once commanded the attention of Manhattan's elite was slipping away into a darkness she had been running from her entire life. The call to 911 came too late. The ambulance sirens that pierced the California morning couldn't compete with the silence that had already claimed her. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the art world that had both celebrated and consumed her. Andy Warhol, the man who had transformed her into a living artwork, would later claim he felt nothing. But those who knew him saw the tremor in his hands when he heard. The official cause of death read acute barbiturate intoxication, clinical words that couldn't capture the magnitude of what had been lost. Here was a girl who had graced the covers of Vogue, danced through the silver-lined halls of the factory, and inspired some of the most haunting songs of the 1960s. Yet she died alone in a hotel room, her dreams reduced to the contents of a pill bottle. But was this really just another tragic overdose of a fallen starlet? Or was something far more sinister at play? The circumstances surrounding Edie's death raised questions that would haunt those who loved her for decades to come. Why had she been staying in a hotel when she had a home? Who had provided the drugs that killed her? And why did so many people who had once claimed to adore her seem so quick to distance themselves from her memory? The girl who had once declared, "I just want to find another way," had found her final escape. But the mystery of how the brightest star in Andy Warhol's constellation burned out so completely would linger like smoke in the galleries where her image still hangs. To understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. Boston's Beacon Hill in 1943 was a world of manicured lawns and carefully guarded secrets, where old money whispered through parlor rooms and family scandals were buried beneath layers of social propriety. Into this rarefied atmosphere, Edith Minturn Sedgwick entered the world on April 20th, born into a family whose wealth could trace its roots back to the judges of the Salem witch trials. The Sedgwicks were American royalty, their name carved into the foundation stones of the nation's elite. But beneath the gilded surface of their world lay a darkness that would shape Edie's entire existence. Picture this scene. A 7-year-old girl in the grand parlor of a Beacon Hill mansion, doodling silver dresses on her father's dinner napkin while the adults discuss family bloodlines over brandy. When Fuzzy Sedgwick notices his daughter's artistic distraction, his brow furrows with the first sign of displeasure that would shape her entire existence. Even at 7, Edie understands that her father's attention is a spotlight she must perform under. Love conditional on entertainment, approval earned through the perfect execution of being charming, being beautiful, being exactly what others needed her to be. The Sedgwick estate, known as the Ranch, sprawled across thousands of acres in California, a kingdom where Fuzzy's word was law, and his children learned early that love was conditional on compliance. Edie's mother, Alice Delano DeForest, came from equally prestigious stock. The Delanos had given America a president in Franklin Roosevelt. But Alice was a fragile woman, overwhelmed by her husband's volatility and unable to protect her children from his psychological warfare. She floated through the mansion like a ghost, elegant and distant, leaving her children to navigate their father's moods alone. In this atmosphere of privilege poisoned by instability, Edie learned to perform, to charm, to do whatever it took to survive. The Sedgwick children were beautiful in that ethereal way that seems to mark families cursed by their own mythology. But beauty in the Sedgwick household came with a price. Fuzzy demanded that his daughters be perfect ornaments to his legacy, while simultaneously undermining their confidence with criticism that cut to the bone. Edie, with her enormous dark eyes and quicksilver movements, was particularly captivating, but she was also the most sensitive to her father's psychological games. Edie never learned how to live, she only learned how to perform. At the ranch, performance meant survival. In Boston society, performance meant acceptance. In New York, performance would mean fame. But what happens when the performance becomes so complete that the person disappears entirely behind the role? At the ranch, she learned that love was theater, that family was a stage where everyone played their assigned roles, and that the price of stepping out of character could be devastating. The first signs of the family's hereditary curse began to manifest as the Sedgwick children entered adolescence. Mental illness ran through the bloodline like a river of mercury, beautiful and toxic. Two of Edie's brothers would eventually take their own lives, unable to escape the psychological prison their father had constructed around them. The family's wealth became a gilded cage, trapping them in cycles of dysfunction that money couldn't cure. Edie's rebellion began early, a flickering flame of defiance that would eventually consume her. She started experimenting with different personas, trying on identities like costumes, searching for some version of herself that could earn her father's approval while maintaining her own sense of self. But in the Sedgwick universe, there was no room for authenticity. There was only the performance and the applause and the crushing silence when the curtain fell. The exclusive boarding schools that followed, first Ethel Walker, then St. Timothy's, offered no escape from the patterns established at home. Edie learned to navigate these privileged institutions with the same survival skills she had developed under her father's roof. Charm the authorities, dazzle her peers, and never let anyone see the cracks in the facade. But the cracks were growing wider with each passing year, and the girl who seemed to have everything was slowly disappearing behind the mask she wore. By 1963, Edie Sedgwick was 20 years old and standing at the crossroads of her destiny. The debutante world of Boston society stretched before her like a perfectly manicured garden path, leading to a predetermined future of charity galas and appropriate marriages. But Edie had always been allergic to the expected, drawn to the edges where proper society frayed into something more dangerous and alive. With a trust fund that guaranteed her financial independence and a beauty that opened every door, she made the decision that would define the rest of her short life. She would conquer New York City. The move from Boston to Manhattan in the early 1960s was like traveling between worlds. Where Boston represented tradition, conformity, and the suffocating weight of family expectation, New York pulsed with possibility, rebellion, and the electric energy of a cultural revolution in the making. Edie rented an apartment on the Upper East Side, a chic sanctuary where she could reinvent herself away from the watchful eyes of her family. But even with unlimited resources and stunning beauty on her side, the transition from sheltered heiress to independent woman proved more challenging than she had anticipated. New York's social scene was unlike anything she had experienced in Boston. Here, talent mattered as much as pedigree. Creativity could trump connections, and the old rules seemed to be rewritten daily. Edie found herself drawn to the city's burgeoning counterculture, fascinated by artists, musicians, and writers who lived by their own codes. She began frequenting galleries in Chelsea, jazz clubs in the Village, and dinner parties where conversation crackled with ideas that would have scandalized her Beacon Hill neighbors. But breaking into New York's elite circles required more than just showing up with the right last name. Edie had to prove herself, had to find her place in an ecosystem where everyone was performing their own version of sophisticated rebellion. She threw herself into the role with the same intense focus she had once applied to pleasing her father. But now she was trying to please an entire city. The parties became her stage, fashion her costume, and her apartment the backdrop for a performance that grew more elaborate with each passing month. The money that had once seemed limitless began to flow like water through her fingers. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, drugs that promised to enhance every experience. Edie was determined to live as intensely as possible, as if she could outrun the ghosts of her childhood through sheer velocity. She became known for her impulsive generosity, picking up checks for entire tables of new friends, buying extravagant gifts for people she barely knew, using her wealth as a tool to purchase the acceptance she craved. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The question would haunt Edie's friends in later years as they watched her transformation from hopeful newcomer to desperate performer. The early days in New York had been filled with genuine excitement, real connections, and the intoxicating feeling that anything was possible. But as the months passed, the line between authentic self-expression and calculated performance began to blur. The modeling jobs started to come, drawn by her otherworldly beauty and that indefinable quality that made people stare. Photographers loved her bone structure, the way light played across her angular features, the intensity that radiated from behind her enormous eyes. But modeling was just another form of performance, another way of being looked at rather than truly seen. Each session reinforced the lesson she had learned at her father's knee. Her value lay in her ability to be beautiful, to be desired, to be the perfect reflection of other people's fantasies. The drugs entered her life gradually, introduced by new friends who promised they would enhance her creativity, dull her anxieties, and help her keep pace with the city's relentless energy. What started as experimentation at parties became a daily necessity, a way of managing the gap between who she was and who she needed to be. The pills promised to make her braver, more brilliant, more beautiful, everything she had always believed she needed to be to earn love. By early 1965, Edie Sedgwick had established herself as one of New York's most captivating figures, but the foundation of her new life was already showing stress fractures. The performing had become exhausting. The drugs were becoming necessary rather than recreational. And the loneliness that had driven her from Boston was following her through the streets of Manhattan like a shadow. She was ready for someone to discover her, to give her a purpose beyond simply being beautiful and rich and fascinatingly damaged. She was ready for Andy Warhol. The factory at 231 East 47th Street was unlike anything Edie Sedgwick had ever experienced, and in 1965 that was saying something. The former hat factory had been transformed into Andy Warhol's artistic kingdom, a silver-lined universe where art, commerce, and pure spectacle collided in ways that redefined what it meant to be famous. The walls were covered in aluminum foil that caught and multiplied every flash of light, creating an environment that felt simultaneously futuristic and fragile, like the inside of a space-age jewelry box. When Edie first walked through those doors, introduced by a photographer friend who thought she might be interesting to Warhol, she was immediately transfigured by the silver light that would become her signature. Warhol saw something in Edie that even she didn't fully understand. Where others saw a beautiful socialite playing at bohemian life, he recognized a living work of art, someone whose very presence could embody his theories about fame, beauty, and the commodification of personality. Within weeks of their meeting, Edie had become his primary muse, appearing in a series of films that would cement her status as the ultimate superstar, a term Warhol coined specifically for people like her, individuals who were famous for the sheer force of their charisma rather than any particular talent. Picture the scene that would define an era: the factory's silver walls catching camera flashes like lightning trapped in foil. Edie at the center of it all in her signature silver mini-dress, laughing with radiant intensity while her eyes betrayed something darker, a hunger that no amount of attention could satisfy. The silver that surrounded her had become her element, but also her prison. She was Mercury in human form, beautiful, captivating, and ultimately toxic to touch. She became a living embodiment of Warhol's aesthetic, a human artwork that moved and spoke and dazzled everyone who encountered her. The girl who had spent her childhood trying to please an impossible father had found a new authority figure, one who seemed to appreciate her exactly as she was. The films they made together, Poor Little Rich Girl, Restaurant, Beauty Number 2 Inches, were revolutionary in their intimacy and their complete abandonment of traditional narrative. Warhol would simply point the camera at Edie and let her exist, capturing the way she moved, spoke, laughed, and occasionally broke down. These weren't performances in any conventional sense. They were documentations of a personality so magnetic that it could hold an audience's attention without script, without direction, without any of the traditional scaffolding of entertainment. Life at the factory became Edie's full-time occupation. She would arrive in the afternoon and stay until dawn, surrounded by a rotating cast of artists, musicians, drag queens, and social climbers who formed Warhol's court. She became the queen of this underground kingdom, the figure around whom parties and conversations and entire evenings revolved. Vogue magazine declared her the Youth Quaker of the Year, and suddenly everyone wanted to dress like her, move like her, embody her particular brand of fragile glamour. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The answer was written in the increasing frequency of her breakdowns, captured on film and witnessed by dozens of people who were too fascinated by the spectacle to intervene. The factory was a place where vulnerability became performance, where personal crisis could be transformed into art. Edie's pain was as much a part of her appeal as her beauty, and Warhol was a master at recognizing the commercial value of human suffering. The money from her trust fund, once seemingly inexhaustible, began to disappear at an alarming rate. The factory lifestyle was expensive. The clothes, the drugs, the constant entertaining. And Edie was generous to a fault with people who seemed to care about her. She bought rounds of drinks for entire bars, picked up dinner checks for tables of people she barely knew, and showered gifts on anyone who showed her kindness. But Andy paid his superstars nothing for appearing in his films, explaining that the exposure was payment enough. Edie was generating enormous amounts of publicity and cultural capital, but she was receiving none of the financial benefits. The relationship with Warhol was complex and ultimately exploitative, though Edie may not have fully recognized it at the time. He gave her the fame she craved and the artistic context that made her feel significant. But he also kept her in a state of emotional dependency that served his needs more than hers. She was his creation, his living artwork, and like all of his work, she was ultimately disposable. The girl who had once believed that love could be earned through perfect performance had found someone who appreciated her performance but remained fundamentally unreachable. As 1965 turned into 1966, Edie Sedgwick was at the absolute pinnacle of her fame. She was featured on the cover of every major magazine, invited to every important party, and recognized on the street by strangers who treated her like visiting royalty. But the higher she rose, the more unstable the foundation became, and the silver girl who had seemed indestructible was about to encounter the forces that would ultimately destroy her. The year 1966 should have been Edie Sedgwick's moment of ultimate triumph, but instead it became the beginning of her most devastating fall. At the height of her factory fame, when her image was appearing in galleries and her face was becoming synonymous with 1960s cool, she encountered the person who would shatter her carefully constructed world. Bob Dylan. The meeting happened at a party, one of those legendary Manhattan gatherings where artists, musicians, and socialites collided in clouds of cigarette smoke and creative energy. Dylan was already a cultural icon, the voice of a generation who had transformed from folk troubadour to electric prophet, and when his eyes met Edie's across the crowded room, something ignited between them that would consume them both. Their affair, if it can even be called that, was conducted largely in shadows and speculation. Dylan was intensely private about his personal life, and Edie was already committed to a role as Warhol's primary muse. But the connection between them was undeniable, a collision of two damaged souls who recognized something essential in each other. Dylan saw in Edie the kind of authentic vulnerability that his songs had always celebrated, while she saw in him the artistic genius and emotional depth that had been missing from her relationship with Warhol. The triangle that formed between Dylan, Edie, and Warhol became one of the most toxic dynamics in 1960s counterculture. Warhol, who had built his empire on the careful management of personalities and relationships, found himself losing control of his most valuable creation. Dylan represented everything that the factory was not: raw, emotional, uninterested in surface glamour, and his influence on Edie threatened to pull her away from the silver-lined world that had made her famous. The competition between the two men played out through Edie, who found herself torn between the comfortable familiarity of the factory and the dangerous allure of genuine artistic passion. The pressure of choosing between these two worlds began to manifest in increasingly erratic behavior. Edie's drug use, which had always been recreational and social, became desperate and solitary. She would disappear for days at a time, sometimes with Dylan, sometimes alone, returning to the factory disheveled and disoriented. The perfect composure that had made her such an ideal subject for Warhol's camera began to crack, revealing the frightened girl beneath the silver surface. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The breakdown of the Dylan-Edie relationship would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. According to those who witnessed their interactions, Dylan was simultaneously drawn to and terrified by Edie's intensity. She represented everything he was trying to escape from in his journey toward becoming a serious artist. The superficiality of fame, the demands of being a public persona, the way that authentic feeling could be commodified and sold. But he was also fascinated by her genuine pain, the way she wore her damage so openly, so beautifully. The end came suddenly and brutally. Dylan, who had never publicly acknowledged their relationship, simply stopped returning her calls. He retreated to Woodstock with his new wife, Sarah, leaving Edie stranded in a world that suddenly felt hostile and empty. The rejection was devastating because it confirmed every fear she had carried since childhood, that she was ultimately unlovable, that even when she gave everything of herself, it would never be enough to make someone stay. Warhol's response to Edie's crisis was characteristically cold. He had seen his superstars burn out before, and he was already cultivating new faces to take her place. When Edie returned to the factory after Dylan's abandonment, she found herself gradually pushed to the periphery, no longer the center of attention, but simply another member of the court. The man who had once called her his greatest creation now treated her like a piece of furniture, present but no longer essential. The songs Dylan wrote during this period, Like a Rolling Stone, Just Like a Woman, Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat, were widely interpreted as being about Edie, cruel portraits of a woman who had lost her way in the machinery of fame. Whether or not Dylan intended them as attacks, Edie heard herself in every line, saw her own destruction reflected in his poetry. The man she had loved was now using their intimacy as material for his art, transforming her private pain into public entertainment. The factory that had once felt like home became a prison of memories and failed possibilities. Every silver surface reflected back a version of herself that no longer existed. Every camera captured the gradual dissolution of the person she had been. The girl who had once declared that she just wanted to find another way was discovering that some paths led only to darkness, and that fame without love was just another form of loneliness. The psychological transformation that followed Edie's romantic and professional disasters was both subtle and profound, like watching a flower slowly close its petals against an approaching storm. The confident young woman who had once commanded every room she entered began to shrink into herself, developing a hypervigilance that made her simultaneously desperate for attention and terrified of being truly seen. She started therapy with a psychiatrist recommended by her family. But even this refuge became another performance space where she learned to tell the stories that would generate the most sympathy without revealing the deepest truths about her pain. The factory continued to orbit around her, but she was no longer its sun. Instead, she had become a dying star whose gravitational pull was weakening by the day. New faces appeared constantly. Nico, the German chanteuse with ice-blonde hair and a voice like broken glass. Viva, the sharp-tongued actress who could match Warhol's detachment with her own. Ultraviolet, whose purple hair and theatrical persona made even Edie seem understated by comparison. Each new superstar represented not just competition but confirmation that she was replaceable, that her brief moment as irreplaceable muse had passed into history. The pills that had once been party accessories became survival tools, ways of managing the crushing anxiety that accompanied every public appearance. Amphetamines to get up, barbiturates to come down, endless variations on the theme of chemical mood control. Edie became expert at calibrating her intake, knowing exactly how much she needed to function in public while still feeling something resembling normal. But normal was becoming an increasingly abstract concept, a memory of a person she might have been in different circumstances. Her apartment on East 63rd Street became both sanctuary and prison, decorated with factory memorabilia and photographs of herself from better days. Friends would find her there in the afternoon, sitting in a shaft of sunlight like a cat, wearing the same silver mini-dress she had worn to some long-forgotten party, chain-smoking cigarettes and watching the world go by through windows that might as well have been screens. She talked constantly about new projects, new possibilities, new ways she was going to reinvent herself. But the energy that had once made these dreams seem possible was flickering like a candle in a draft. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Edie's attempts at rehabilitation were sincere but ultimately unsuccessful, undermined by the very qualities that had made her famous. She couldn't bear to be ordinary, couldn't accept that recovery might mean becoming the kind of person who went unnoticed in restaurants or walked down the street without being recognized. Fame had become so entwined with her identity that losing it felt like a kind of death. But maintaining it required resources, emotional, financial, physical, that she no longer possessed. The modeling work that had once seemed effortless became increasingly difficult to secure and even harder to complete. Photographers who had once fought to work with her now spoke in whispers about her unreliability, her tendency to arrive hours late or not at all, the way her face had begun to show the strain of her lifestyle. The camera that had once loved her now seemed cruel, capturing every flaw, every sign of deterioration. She would study the contact sheets obsessively, searching for traces of the girl she had been, but finding only evidence of who she was becoming. Family relationships, already strained by years of rebellion and scandal, reached a breaking point. Her father's attempts to control her from a distance took the form of threats to cut off her trust fund, conditional love disguised as tough love. Her mother's gentle suggestions that she return home to recover were interpreted as attempts to trap her back in the world she had fought so hard to escape. Even her siblings, dealing with their own struggles with the family curse of mental illness and addiction, found it difficult to help someone who seemed determined to destroy herself so publicly. Yet beneath the chaos and the pharmaceuticals and the desperate attempts to recapture past glory, something essential about Edie remained intact. Friends from this period remember moments when the old spark would return, when she would suddenly become the most charming, insightful, genuinely funny person in the room. These glimpses of her authentic self were like messages from someone trapped behind glass, proof that somewhere inside the wreckage of her public persona, the real Edie Sedgwick was still fighting to survive. By 1970, Edie Sedgwick had entered what would prove to be the final chapter of her short life, though she seemed determined to write it as a story of redemption rather than surrender. The girl who had once been the toast of Manhattan had retreated to California following a pattern familiar to many casualties of the 1960s counterculture, fleeing East Coast sophistication for West Coast healing, trading the silver-lined factory for the golden promise of a fresh start. She was 27 years old, an age when most people are just beginning to understand who they might become, but she carried herself with the weariness of someone who had already lived several lifetimes. The decision to leave New York was both practical and symbolic. The city had become a museum of her former selves, every street corner a reminder of parties she could no longer afford to throw, every gallery a showcase of an aesthetic she had helped create but could no longer embody. California offered anonymity, the possibility of reinventing herself away from the scrutiny of people who remembered when she had been somebody. She settled first in Los Angeles, then in Santa Barbara, gravitating toward places where the light was softer and the pace slower, as if she could heal herself through geography. The move coincided with a genuine attempt at sobriety, though like everything else in Edie's life, it was complicated by the very qualities that had made her famous. She entered therapy with a psychiatrist who specialized in treating artists and entertainers, someone who understood that for people like her, the line between authentic self-expression and self-destruction was often dangerously thin. The work was painful, requiring her to confront not just her drug use but the deeper patterns of self-sabotage that had shaped her entire adult life. For brief periods, the treatment seemed to work. Friends from this time describe a different Edie, calmer and more grounded, someone who could have conversations that weren't performances and silences that weren't fraught with desperation. She began exploring interests that had nothing to do with being looked at. Pottery, gardening, reading books that had nothing to do with art or fashion or the social dynamics of fame. These activities gave her hands something to do besides shake, her mind something to focus on besides the constant calculation of how she was being perceived. The relationship with Michael Post, a struggling actor she met in California, represented her most serious attempt at conventional happiness. Post was handsome in an unremarkable way, kind without being particularly interesting, the sort of person who offered stability rather than excitement. For someone who had spent her adult life ricocheting between emotional extremes, his steadiness was deeply appealing. They married in July 1971. A small ceremony that attracted none of the media attention that had once followed her everywhere. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question haunted those who knew her during this period, watching her attempt to construct a normal life from the wreckage of her extraordinary one. The marriage was both a genuine attempt at happiness and a form of protective coloration, a way of signaling to the world that she was no longer the wild child of the factory but a respectable married woman trying to build something lasting. But the patterns established in childhood and reinforced by fame were not easily broken. Even in California, even with a husband who loved her, even with therapy and good intentions and all the tools supposedly necessary for recovery, Edie found herself drawn back toward the edge. The performance that had once been her survival mechanism now became her cage. Even in therapy, even with Michael, even in the supposed safety of California, Edie found herself unable to stop performing the role of Edie Sedgwick in recovery. She would play housewife with the same desperate intensity she had once brought to playing superstar. But the silver thread that connected all her performances was growing thinner, more fragile, ready to snap. The final performance would be her most convincing, acting normal, acting happy, acting like tomorrow was a given. But behind the silver smile, the calculations had already been made. Some stars burn brightest just before they burn out completely. Post later described feeling like he was married to a ghost, someone who was physically present but emotionally unreachable, trapped behind barriers that love alone couldn't breach. He would find her sitting by windows at odd hours, staring out at the California landscape as if waiting for something that would never come. When he asked what she was thinking about, she would smile and say nothing, but the nothing seemed to contain all the weight of everything she had lost. Return now to that final scene, a Santa Barbara hotel room where silver earrings catch the morning light one last time. Silence thick as velvet draping over a performance that would never have an encore. Edie Sedgwick, the girl who had never learned to exist without an audience, had finally found the only peace possible for someone who had been consumed by the very fame that created her. The funeral in Massachusetts was small, private, conspicuously absent of silver dresses. The Boston Brahmins gathered to mourn not just a daughter, but the waste of a life that had started with such promise. Andy Warhol did not attend, claiming he was too busy with work. His absence spoke volumes. She had been fascinating as an image, disposable as a human being. When reached for comment about her death, Warhol offered only his characteristic coldness. "I didn't really know her that well." Ugh. This from the man who had filmed her for hundreds of hours, who had made her the face of his artistic revolution, who had transformed her vulnerability into commercial art. But perhaps the truest epitaph came from the Velvet Underground's Femme Fatale, written specifically about Edie, playing like a prophecy fulfilled. "Here she comes, you better watch your step. She's gonna break your heart in two, it's true." Edie Sedgwick wasn't just a girl who died at 28. She was the first warning shot across the bow of our image-obsessed culture. Proof that in the age of mechanical reproduction, fame itself can be fatal. The silver girl who burned so brightly had left behind more than just photographs and films. She had left a cautionary tale about what happens when human beings become content, when vulnerability becomes commodity, when the performance becomes so complete that the person disappears entirely. The machinery that consumed her continues to operate today, finding new faces to transform into brands, new souls to feed into the silver screen of social media. What hidden truths about the cost of being watched might her story still reveal to those brave enough to look beyond the glittering surface?